Deaths in Glenmorach Manor, a fiction novel. Written by Shirley, read by Sir Lawrence Olivier. This audiobook was narrated using synthetic voice technology provided by 11 Labs. Chapter 29. It was drizzling when the authorities arrived at Glenmorach Manor, a sort of grey drizzle that matched the weight hanging in the air. I stood by the grand staircase, watching the patrol cars crunch over the gravel drive, their blue lights flickering through the mist like ghosts in mourning. Mr. Morrison opened the big entrance door, and I saw Inspector Harris's face tense up as we locked eyes. Walking behind him was a group of 2 police officers ready to take Alan with them. 2 other officers stood guard at the outer door. Lord Wallace sat silently in his wheelchair in his study. He hadn't spoken a word since Mrs. Thompson's confession earlier. His normally composed stature now slumped, his eyes vacant. I'd seen men broken before, but never like this. A man haunted not by what he did, but by what he failed to do. The truth came crashing down upon him like lightning. It unfolded like a slow, suffocating tide. The moment he learned that Alan Faulkner, the very man who had driven a dagger into his firstborn son's back, was the same child he had abandoned in the shadows of his youth, something inside him shattered beyond repair. His expression was still, as if time itself had paused to watch his soul unravel. Grief and guilt clashed violently within him. Grief for the son he had lost to death, and guilt for the one he had abandoned and never acknowledged, the one who had grown up in silence, resentment, and rejection. In that instant, Lord Wallace felt like he was no longer the noble Viscount of Ayrshire, but a father, twice broken by the same sin. The weight of it pressed into his chest, heavy as stone, and he realized, with devastating clarity, that it was not just a murderer he had created, but a tragedy born from his own absence. The officers entered with quiet respect, as though they understood the gravity of the home they were walking into. I led them through the corridor, past portraits of ancestors long dead and legacies now shattered. In the study room, Alan was still curled up on the floor, while Wallace stood frozen, staring at the police who had come to take him away. He didn't run, didn't fight. His eyes were glassy, as though he'd already surrendered to the justice he knew would come. Mrs. Thompson clutched his hand tightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. She wept at his feet, unwilling to let him go. She cried, "Alan, my son, forgive me for ever letting you come to this." He turned, gently placing a kiss on her forehead. "No, Mother, you were the only light in my life. I walked away from it. I couldn't bear the shadow anymore." Mrs. Thompson collapsed to her knees as the officers reached for Alan, her body trembling, hands clinging desperately to the hem of his coat, as though her grip alone could keep him from being taken. Her sobs were not loud. They were the deep, soul-torn cries of a mother watching her child slip beyond her reach, perhaps forever. "Please, don't take him," she whispered hoarsely, her face buried against his legs, the strength in her voice unraveling with each breath. Alan froze. His whole body was trembling, and for a moment the defiant mask he had worn since the day of the murder crumbled into something raw and ruined. He knelt beside her, gently lifting her face, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. He said, his voice choked, "Mother, I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." His throat caught, and he leaned forward to press a kiss to her forehead. "Forgive me for dragging your love through the mud, for being the reason your heart breaks like this." She shook her head, tears spilling endlessly. "You are all I have, Alan. You are my son." As he was pulled to his feet by the officers, her hands reached after him one last time, shaking, desperate, knowing well that under the law of the 1930s in Scotland, a murder conviction could mean the gallows. Alan turned his face away, not out of shame, but out of agony, for he would rather have died 1,000 times than be the cause of his mother's sorrow. And yet, that was the cruel truth he had carved with his own hands. The constables moved forward, and he raised his arms for the cuffs without resistance. Lady Eleanor broke through the line of officers with a cry so anguished it stopped everyone in their tracks. "Wait!" she cried out, her voice slicing through the cold air like a blade. "You cannot take him. Not yet." Her silk gown flowed behind her like a forgotten dream, her hair undone. She reached Alan and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks as she whispered, "Alan, how do I ever forget loving you?" she cried. Alan closed his eyes, every muscle in his body trembling, as he couldn't return her embrace. She was still sobbing, and her fingers were grasping the fabric of his coat as though she could hold time itself still. She was sobbing through her tears. "Don't take him. Please, don't take him away from me." Alan stood still, frozen, as Lady Eleanor held him tightly. There was no comfort he could offer, only the unbearable ache of her love and his guilt colliding. She loved him still, despite everything, despite the blood on his hands, the blood of her brother, Benjamin, whom she had loved. And though her heart was torn in two, she couldn't let go of the man who had once made her feel alive. But the cruelest truth that cut deeper than any dagger was the revelation that the man she was deeply in love with was her own half-brother, the son her father had abandoned in shame. Their love, once pure in her eyes, now carried a weight neither of them could bear. Alan lowered his forehead to hers, eyes wet and hollow. "My lady, you must live. You deserve happiness and a real life, a life that I could never give to you." She shook her head violently, lips quivering. "Don't call me my lady. You are my darling brother. You are a part of me. I don't want a life without you, Alan." His voice broke as he replied, "But that's the only one left. Go, live your life. Be happy for me." He smiled at her for the last time, then turned his head and walked away from the love of his life. The officers gently pulled her away, but her arms reached for him, even as she sobbed his name. Alan turned, unable to watch, leaving Lady Eleanor collapsed in Anthony's arms, her cries echoing through the stone walls, like a melody of love that had no place left to go. Her sobbing was heard, until the last moment she saw Alan leave the Glenmorach Manor. Lord Wallace's heart shattered upon seeing the misery that Lady Eleanor and Alan should bear. Without realizing it, tears rolled down his cheeks. He turned his face away, unable to witness what was unfolding before him, what was happening before his eyes had tormented his soul. And then, like a scene etched in marble, the constables led Alan toward the police car. His boots echoed against the flagstone path, each step a reminder of the irreversible. Mrs. Thompson collapsed onto her knees, wailing like a mother mourning a son she never got to raise the way he deserved. Lord Wallace, in his wheelchair, emerged from his study room just in time to witness Alan being loaded into the police vehicle. Their eyes met. They both looked hollow. As the car doors shut, Alan turned his face to the window. His eyes met Eleanor's once more. And then he turned his head, his gaze fixed far ahead. He never looked back again. The police car rolled away through the mist, leaving the rest of us standing like statues carved in grief. Part 2. Ending. It was the next morning after Alan Faulkner had been taken into custody. The manor was still, as though the house itself were trying to breathe again after weeks of grief, secrecy, and bloodshed. I was just finishing a quiet breakfast in the dining room with John, my old mate, the trusted legal counsel to the Wallace family, when we heard a commotion at the front door. Mr. Morrison came in with a slight smile. Lady Stewart has arrived. I rose to my feet and looked at John, who gave me a knowing glance. Lady Gracie Celine Stewart. She had once been the fiancée of the late Benjamin Wallace from an arranged engagement. And I hadn't expected to see her now, not after all that had happened. But the heart, as I've learned, had its own unpredictable ways. Anthony Wallace was already rushing down the hallway when she stepped inside, her eyes wide and unsure. "Gracie," he breathed. And just like that, all hesitation vanished. He took her into his arms, like a man who'd been walking through fire and finally found cool air. They stood there a moment, lost in one another. Then, hand in hand, Anthony led her to the drawing room where Lord Wallace and Lady Lucy were seated. I watched from the doorway as he took a deep breath. Anthony said gently, "Uncle, Mama, there's been enough sadness in this house, and I've spent too long holding back what I feel. I truly love Gracie, and I wish to ask for your blessing to marry her." Lady Gracie's eyes welled with tears. She looked both nervous and hopeful. Lord Wallace looked at them, silent for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he smiled, truly smiled for the first time in weeks, and slowly straightened his body. He said, placing a hand on Anthony's shoulder, "You have my blessing, Anthony. Both of you deserve happiness after all that happened." Lady Lucy stood next, embracing Anthony and Gracie warmly. "Anthony, darling, I give you all the blessings a mother can give. And you, Gracie, my sweet girl, welcome to the family." I don't often get sentimental, but I won't lie. There was a weight in my chest then, watching joy return to this wounded family, a little hope stitched into the ruins. Before lunchtime, Glenmorach Manor was quiet, the kind of quiet that sits on your chest and won't let go. Lord Wallace hadn't spoken much. He spent most of his time in the library, the very room where Benjamin was killed, sitting behind the very desk, staring at the fireplace. I was packing my things. My job as his private detective was done. But this case, this family, it had left a mark. John and I went to see Lord Wallace. He didn't say much, just handed me an envelope sealed with the Wallace crest. He said, "Ernest, if you ever write about this, don't write it as a tragedy. Write it as a reckoning." I nodded and we turned to leave. Then he paused us both at the doorway. "Ernest?" He spoke to me again without facing me. He looked like me, didn't he? "Alan?" I took a long breath and smiled. "Yes, my lord, he did." John and I were ready to leave and return to London. Our time at Glenmorach Manor had come to an end. But before we departed, we walked through the west garden, heading toward Wallace's private chapel. There, standing still as stone beneath the old yew tree, was Robert Wallace. He turned as we approached. His face was pale and tired, but calm. "Mr. Owen." "Mr. Barnett," he said, nodding. We said nothing at first, just stood beside him, our eyes on the simple headstone that bore his older brother's name. Benjamin Arthur Wallace, beloved son and brother, born the 20th of January, 1911, died the 30th of October, 1936. Taken too soon, may his soul find peace. Robert spoke first. He was going to be a great man, you know. He had his flaws, but he believed in the legacy. He believed in this family. Despite all the disagreements and arguments that we had as brothers, we both knew that we loved each other deep down. I said quietly, "He loved you. He would have been proud to see how you're carrying on." Robert looked down at the earth beneath his feet. "I still hear him sometimes. His laugh, his teasing. I never imagined I'd have to bury him so soon." There was silence, the kind that humbles a man. John stepped forward. "He's at peace now, Robert." Robert turned to us with a solemn nod. "Thank you, both of you, for everything." You're always welcome here whenever you wish to return." We said nothing more. The wind moved softly through the trees as we began walking with him toward the graveyard nearby. There, beneath the smaller, more humble stones, was the resting place of Rosie Taylor. Her name was etched delicately. Flowers had been laid earlier that morning, by Robert himself, no doubt. He knelt, gently placing a hand on the stone. "I still love her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't believe she's gone. Sometimes I think I'd see her in the garden, or hear her singing by the river." I laid a hand on his shoulder. "You'll never forget her, Robert. Perhaps you shouldn't. But I promise, one day someone will come along to make you smile again. Someone who helps you live." He looked up at me, tears in his eyes. Then he nodded, though his grief hadn't lessened. "Perhaps one day." We stood a moment longer in silence. And then it was time. The Wallace family car was already waiting for us. As we approached, John and I turned back one last time. Robert was still standing there, standing alone by Rosie's grave, his coat stirring in the breeze. Then he looked in our direction. We tipped our hats, nodding a farewell. He raised his hand in response, but remained silent. As the car rolled away from Glenmorach Manor, the manor itself slowly disappeared behind the hedgerows and trees. The past few weeks had been heavier than most cases I've handled. The train pulled away from Kilmarnock station, and I saw something rare through glass. The sky was blue, not a cloud in sight. The sun was shining across the Scottish hills with a clarity I'd never seen here before. A blessing, perhaps, for all that had passed. John leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. "You've still got it, Owen." I smiled faintly, feeling the rhythm of the tracks beneath my boots. "Yeah," I said, tipping my hat forward over my brow. "I'm still the best damn detective in the West End, London." That night, I found myself back in my London office. I was writing this final report by lamplight, the last chapter in a story that began with blood and ended with heartbreak. The house of Wallace might never fully recover, or perhaps it will, as all things do in time. But one thing is certain. No secret stays buried forever. And when it rises, it asks a price. This is the end of Deaths in Glenmorach Manor. Thank you for listening.